guest today was appointed chairperson of the Chicago Transit Authority Board by Mayor Daley in September 2003. She is a director of the Regional Transportation Authority and a member of the Chicago Planning Commission. Our guest today holds a bachelor's degree in management from Kellogg and a bachelor's degree from Harvard. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the City Club of Chicago the chairperson of the Chicago Transit Authority Board, Carole Brown. Carole?
Thank you. Wow. It's a lot easier to be up here when I see all the friendly faces that are in the crowd. So I just want to start by thanking all my friends who came out here today. You know, since the mayor appointed me chief to the Chicago Transit Authority almost 13 months ago, I get pretty much two questions quite frequently. The first question is, how are you doing both jobs? How are you serving as a senior vice president at Lehman Brothers, and how are you running the CTA? And what I tell people is that I don't run the CTA, thank God. I am chair of the board, and for that, I try to set policy and then make sure that policy is executed. But the running of the CTA is really done by a very talented management team that's headed by Frank Cruzzi, and he's here, and there are a lot of CTA folks here. Everyone who's here from CTA, just get up. And I also have been blessed with an amazing board, and I have 3 board members here, and I just wanted to let them know that you guys make my job so much easier, and I appreciate your love and support, and it is a pleasure working with all 3, and all of my board members, actually. And the second part of that question is, how can I do this? Is because I work with equally impressive people at Lehman Brothers, both here and in New York. And 2 of those people are here today. My partner, good friend and colleague, Beth Coolidge, who's also senior vice president at Lehman, who makes it so much easier for me to do what I need to do at CTA. So that's stand up. And then the woman who runs our office, and she's our office manager, and if any of you have called me trying to get an appointment with CTA or trying to get something done by Lehman Brothers, you know you have to go through Kelly Blizzard. And if Kelly ever decided to go do something else, both Beth and I were retired because we could not handle it. So Kelly's here. Finally, the other question that people ask me is, how do I handle Frank Cruzzi? It's taken me 13 months to realize this, but you don't handle Frank Cruzzi. But what you do is you just sit back and you let Frank do what Frank does, and in the course of doing that, you learn a lot, and hopefully we get some important things done. And before I start, the last thing I need to do is acknowledge 2 people at CTA who work for me, 2 gentlemen who every day I wake up and pray that they still work for me, because I know that one day the private sector is going to steal them away to more money and to more glory. But right now they're here working for what they work for and for me, and that is my chief of staff, Carole, and our vice president of finance and treasury, Dennis. We've been in the news a little bit lately, and the reason we've been in the news is that there's some really critical issues that are facing regional transportation today, and those issues are coming home to roost, if you will, for the CTA. And I say transportation, not transit, because our public transit system is a critical part of the region's entire transportation system and of our economy. And despite all evidence to the contrary, I am not a policy wonk, I am not a politician, I am indeed an investment banker. And so I can appreciate certain aspects of the appeal of railroads and flush routes. But I am more interested in what transit means for this region's quality of life. their jobs, clean air, and the mobility that makes this a world-class city. Unfortunately, I think our competitive advantage is at risk. According to a recent study by the Texas Transportation Institute, the Chicago area is the nation's third most congested. Most of you are not aware of how the decline in our transit ridership has had a direct impact on that congestion. In the 2 decades since the Illinois General Assembly last revised transit funding, transit ridership has dropped by about 150 million trips per year. Over that same period, the cost of congestion increased over $3 billion. That amounts to a traffic tax of almost $1,000 per driver. Today, I am here to tell you that transit ridership and traffic congestion will get dramatically worse if we don't fix the way transit is funded. The CTA and PACE, and therefore the RTA, have a structural deficit that cannot be solved by a one-time fix. Unless anyone believes that this structural problem is of our own making, let me take a minute to tell you how we got here. This is our very simple funding formula. Approximately 50% of the operating costs of CTA, Metro, and PACE are covered by fare box revenue. That's what we call our recovery ratio. The rest of our operating costs are covered by government support in the form of sales tax. So 1% sales tax in the city of Chicago and suburban Cook, and a 1/4% sales tax in the Powder counties. This past Friday, at legislative hearings called by Speaker Madigan and chaired by Representative Julie Amos, the authors of the 1983 RTA Act indicated that the distribution of those taxes is calculated based on the projected deficits of the 3 service agencies. Now, I'm not going to walk you through the details of this chart, but it's clear that the mathematics of 1983 are no longer relevant to the deficits facing the RTA today. The CTA has a structural problem because the region's funding has not kept up with inflation. The far right column shows total RTA funding trailing inflation by 0.3% each year over 20 years. More critically, CTA, the agency that provides 4 out of every 5 trips, has seen its funding decline in real terms by almost 1% each year. The current formula also does not prioritize transit funding based on performance measures. Here you see that CTA has provided 80% of the region's trips for 3 decades, but it only gets 59% of the funding. And let me preempt or anticipate my Metro colleagues, including Mayor Michael Smith, from the Metro Board by saying that I know that they would use passenger miles in this equation, and I think they have a fair point. I think passenger miles are another important measure of performance, but my point is that the current formula doesn't pay attention to either. Due in part to a static, arbitrary funding mechanism, the CTA's funding was eroded since 1975. Now remember, the funding mechanism I'm describing has not changed since 1983. So let me put that in context for you. In 1983, Mike Dickman was a rookie coach, and George Allen Nash was still in prime time. Michael Jordan was just a sophomore at the University of North Carolina. Oh yes, and in 1983, I wasn't particularly worried about transit funding formulas, or for that matter, $10 billion pension deals. I was worried about the economy. And knowing what that attention should be. Something's changed. I'm amazed that the U.S. Congress refused transportation funding every 6 years, and that it has been 21 years since Illinois has done the same. Like anything that hasn't changed for 2 decades, the RTA Act has collected dust, and myths and legends have come around it. Many myths about CTA have been around for a long time, but some of the newest accusations have somehow taken on their own mythological status. It's time to dispel some of those myths. The first is that the CTA just serves the city of Chicago. CTA provides 1.5 million trips each day. That's more passenger boardings than United, Delta, and Southwest Airlines combined. CTA is also the region's largest suburban transit provider, providing nearly half of all suburban transit trips and carrying more suburbanites than either Metro or PACE. That means if CTA service is cut, customers in the suburbs and the city will suffer. And that brings me to my second myth, that the CTA does not affect those people who drive. The CTA carries a huge proportion of the people traveling along our major expressways. Almost half of the people in the Kennedy corridor are using the CTA. And if you drove here this morning on the Kennedy Expressway, imagine, if you will, how much longer your commute would have taken if there were an additional 1,000 cars coming onto the road every 8 minutes. According to the Federal Highway Administration statistics, just 3% of those customers switched to their cars. The Kennedy were approaching complete gridlock. I don't care how many people buy an iPad, the I-90 will be backed up to rock. The same concept holds for the Eisenhower, the Stevenson, the Dan Ryan, and Lakeshore Drive. Another myth, perpetuated by those who wish to maintain the status quo, for what I believe is their own self-interest, is that the system has been stable for 21 years and that the RTA does not believe there is a problem. If the RTA system works, then why has ridership dropped by 150 million trips per year? Why has congestion increased? Why did the RTA board unanimously vote on September 10th for a different level of operating funding that would be provided by the RTA formula? Because the status quo is not acceptable. Under the law, the RTA must evaluate the needs of transit in the region. Based on RTA staff's own analysis of that need, the funding marks added $17 million for PACE, $35 million for Metro, and $82.5 million for CTA, over and above what the existing formula would provide. The RTA board agreed with the increased level of operating funding, but did not support the staff's recommendation to require the increase to come from capital funds. You can see from this chart that the problem gets worse in 2006 and 2007, demonstrating the structural nature of this problem. This is not the fault of the economy, or 911, or any other excuse those who defend the status quo will have you believe. The RTA also directed each service pro to prepare 2 budgets. One is the General Assembly Act, service provider funding, and one is the does not. Which brings me to my next myth, that the CTA is manufacturing this crisis and in pointing out the structural flaws in the current mechanism wants to take money from Metro, an agency that is already subsidizing CTA operations. Our critics make the argument that Metro subsidizes Chicago service because it gets none of Chicago's sales tax revenue. If we applied their logic to the funding formula, Metro would get less than 10% of the Chicago sales tax, and CTA would get 62% of the suburban coke revenue, a $100 million shift in the opposite direction. And that's the problem with this stovepipe approach. It creates arbitrary outcomes that have little basis in policy. For example, as this chart shows, suburban Cook County has been subsidizing Metro's Collier County services for years. And before anyone says Collier counties make up for the difference in sales tax rates by spending money in the city of Chicago, let me remind you that Crane Chicago Business reported earlier this year that the imbalance really goes the other way. Chicago residents spend a net $6.5 billion in the suburbs each year, which under the current formula means a loss of $65 million in sales tax revenue to the CTA. But let me be really clear. I do not want to take funding from any of the other service boards. We are a regional integrated system and we need to grow together. 2 out of every 5 PACE customers transfer to CTA, and CTA connects thousands of Metro customers each day to retail, employment, and entertainment centers in Chicago. For months, employment has been advocating for increased funding for all of the service boards. With a bigger pie, you can have a performance-based funding mechanism that enables and encourages everyone to improve their service. I support more funding for both Metro and PACE, as well as for the CTA. As an RTA board member, I introduced and voted for the funding mark that increased their funding. I support each of the initiatives you see here, and more. But the thing we have to keep in mind is that those services are more expensive than traditional transit. They are equally important, but they require more money. And here you see that cost differential in detail. The public subsidy, not the fare, but the public subsidy, the RTA sales tax revenue that supports transit varies dramatically from place to place. A CTA customer in Chicago receives 7 cents in public support, while the Collier County PACE and Metro customers receive over $3. I support all these services, but we need more funding if we want to avoid major service cuts. And these dramatic service cuts may be necessary to balance the budget because CTA can no longer manage this structural problem internally. This chart shows you how CTA has dealt with the structural deficit since 1997. In real dollars, funding has declined by $251 million. Our CTA reduced its annual cost structure through efficiencies, reduction in the number of positions, a new fare system, and other steps to save $118 million between 1997 and 2003. In 2004, facing a significant deficit, CTA cut $26 million, including a deficit of almost 450 positions. CTA raised approximately $30 million from the 2004 base fare increase to $1.75. But as you can see, we are still far from balance. Both 2005 budget proposals include $13 million in additional cost savings and $9 million in increased revenue from increases to non-base fares, including parking, paratransit, and the U-Pass. But that still leaves us with a $55 million deficit. The CTA board is continuing to evaluate President Cruz's 2005 budget proposals. The board may make some changes, but the gap is so large that our only options are fare increases and/or significant service reductions that will take effect January 2nd. If we are serious about tackling traffic congestion, we need to provide enough transit funding to maintain current service. As I mentioned earlier, the authors of the 1983 legislation told the General Assembly on Friday that the funding structure was calculated based on the projected deficits of each of the three services, CTA, Suburban Bus, and Metro. Now, the projected deficits of CTA and PACE are $100 million and growing each year into the future. So let me take you back to the very first chart. This is a picture of a system that worked for 5 or 6 years, and then CTA had to close its structural deficit by gradually cutting service and by significantly increasing fares. This is not a system that works. CTA is attacked so vigorously by Jeff Ladd and political leaders in the Collier counties, I can only ask, what are they afraid of? Increased funding? I don't think so. There was a fascinating interchange in Friday's transit hearing when Metro's president acknowledged that if CTA got more money, they wanted more. Not because they needed it, because they didn't want to be left out. But it's CTA that has paid the price for this unbalanced system. Our bus service, which is hit particularly hard under RTA's accounting system, has declined by 50%. And CTA customers have paid the price. The fare increases are almost 5 times higher than Metro and 50% higher than PACE. So I ask again, what are the Collier counties so afraid of? I think if you look at the facts I've laid out today, the region as a whole has supported the growth of the Collier counties. The Collier County service, by definition, is more expensive. The distances are longer and the population is less dense. Some of PACE's strongest suburb-to-suburb routes have a 30% recovery ratio. That is, only 30% of their costs are covered by fares. So let me be clear. We need to support that service. It's important to the entire region, but it's also expensive. I will fight together with the Collier counties to get additional funding. They cannot continue to grow at the expense of a reduction in CTA's ridership. So perhaps the system is more imbalanced than we thought. Perhaps Metro needs to be subject to the same level of scrutiny as CTA. Perhaps Metro's board needs to ask the same tough questions that CTA's board has been asking of its own agency. In my testimony to the General Assembly, I asked for greater investment in transit, but I also asked for a more efficient, accountable, performance-driven system. Maybe it's naive of me to think that an investment banker can bring efficiency, accountability, and performance to government. But it's not naive for the taxpayers to expect that accountability from their public officials, especially when the stakes are so high. We need to put aside the petty politics because transportation is too important. The Illinois congressional delegation has been very successful at working across party and regional lines to increase federal funding for transportation. When they do so, everybody wins. The Illinois General Assembly should do the same thing, and everyone, Metro, PACE, CTA, Carole County suburbs, suburban Cook, the city, businesses, residents, workers, and the environment wins. Everybody wins. Thank you.
City Club rules are you have to identify yourself. Then it's up to you to sandbag if you like. Great speech, lovely speech. No questions.
I have a question, but I'm all for
Well, then speak loud.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cooley, for inviting myself. I'm up with President Vincent Radio on 308. I represent the rails. Carole, I mean, you just said everything that needs to be said, but my question goes to you and Mr. Cruiser. What if we don't get the 82.5 and we get the 55 million? Will we still experience cuts and layoffs?
The question was, what would happen if we didn't get $0.5 million that is in our, that was in the RTA funding warrants for 2005. I think as our chart showed, we have what is projected to be a $55 million deficit that is what is causing this recommendations for service cuts. The budget that contemplates $82.5 million actually includes some enhancements in service. So if we got some number less than 82.5 and some number greater than 55, we would not have to institute such great service reductions.
Yes.
Hi, Sharice with the school marketing group. I've had an occasion to look at the advertising, the CJAC campaign, and one caught my eye in particular for professional reasons. CJAC spoke, CJAC broke. And I would like to see Jack broker. So I would like to know, what can you do to stop smoking on CTA property, and particularly, unfortunately, the smoking of CTA employees on CTA property?
So as I noted earlier, I don't run CTA. That's right. But in all seriousness, our personnel, our customer service assistants are told that we don't want eating on the trains, that we don't want smoking in our stations, and we try to enforce that, and clearly we need to do a better job.
Hello, I'm Lawrence Consol with the Civic Federation. One, I want to commend you for your theme, which is that we have a regional system and we have to find a regional solution to it. I think everyone would agree with that. You mentioned the success the CTA has had and Metro's had in getting federal capital. Could you address the issue of the federal transit subsidy, operating subsidy, and also the RTA's implementation of Americans with Disabilities and the impact on the CTA?
Sure. One of the things that people don't realize is that probably our single largest growing operating cost is the cost of paratransit services. In order to be in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, we as a public transportation agency have to provide 100% of the demand for transit for individuals who fall under that act. The cost of a paratransit ride is $26 per ride. We currently charge our paratransit customers $1.75, and the projected budget for 2005, where Franklin has recommended doubling that to $350, which we can do legally. So each ride costs us about $23 or $25 before the fare increase. And we have to provide 100% of the demand. So it's a cost without, it's a federally funded program without a federally funded revenue source. The growth with the federal government ceasing to give operating subsidy money to large urban transit agencies. So while they instituted the Americans with Disabilities Act, they stopped giving larger transit agencies any kind of federal operating subsidy. So it has exacerbated the pressure on our operating budget.
Any other questions?
I'm gonna run over.
Well, one more question and then we gotta catch the CTA, everyone.
Hi, I'm Nancy Dulay, and I recently retired from the Chicago Commission on Human Relations, and I have become a senior citizen. So I have this card, right? Now, we're supposed to put money on the card, and then we can use it to enter. Every time I put money on the card, I've either had it lost or stolen. So what I've decided to do is I show it and then put my money in, and you have to have change. You know, you can't use bills. So at any rate, the last time I was at State and Van Buren, and I showed him the card and asked him, you know, for transfers, and he told me he couldn't do it, that I had to use the card. Now I said, you know, I've also gotten lines on this when it goes through the machine. Then once this is all lined up, you can't use this card anymore. So you have to show it. Now, I was wondering if you could find another solution for that. Because I had to, he was so arrogant and so impertinent that I walked over to Adams and Wabash, and the fellow there was very nice and just gave me a transfer the way they should do. So what is your solution for that? And are we going to pay more now?
Just ask one, you asked a lot of
And, you know, ultimately, we would like to have one single fare media for all of our riders. And for those people who have not the magnetic strip cards, but the smart card technology, we tend to avoid those kind of problems. And so I think ultimately, if we get the money we need to maintain our organization, we're going to kind of migrate to one fare technology that can recognize all our different classes of riders. In the meantime, you know, what we need to do is just make sure that our employees are trained to be courteous and to assist our customers. And so that's what we can do in the short term.
Thank you.